Hi, this is Malcolm Stern, and this is my podcast, Slay Your Dragons. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome this morning Bill Murtha. Bill is a friend of mine from many years back, and he has the most extraordinary story of survival and changing his life through adversity. And it's one of the great stories. You wouldn't believe this story. You're going to believe it in a minute because he's going to tell you it. But you wouldn't believe this story if you read it. There's so many sort of strange things in it. But very, very much a lot of the theme that we are doing with these podcasts are people who have had adversity in their lives and then made major changes. And Bill, you made a major change in your life. You were a semi-pro footballer, I think, at one time,
Yeah,
and,
I was a sales
and fit
salesman,
and a
and fit
salesman.
and very fit. Yeah, yeah. And one day, but not so much now.
No, no, I can see that. You look a bit of a wreck these days, but that's all right. But this is an extraordinary story, and I when I first heard the story, it was almost unbelievable. But I know that this is true, and I know that you have changed your life as a result of one freak incident. So, would you like to tell us a bit about that and what was the dragon you had to slay? What did you have to find in yourself to come through this and become who you are now?
I mean, the dragon. Start off with the dragon. The dragon was probably emotions, really, Malcolm, for a lot of us British men. I wasn't particularly good at expressing my emotions. I was very much kind of, it's all about outer achievement. And so, I had a job that was very busy, very much kind of 24/7, repeat, more, it was all about accumulating more things. That was part of my accolade and identity. And, I wasn't in a very good place, at the time. This is going back to 1999, by the way. And at a time when, on the outside, my life seemed to look brilliant, great cars, new cars, big, holidays every year, big bonuses, lived in a big house with my ex-wife and two children. Everything to the outside world looked perfect. And yet inside, beating yourself up, not feeling good enough. And like a lot of people, I'd use sort of substance abuse to kind of shut down that inner critic and that kind of feeling of not enough. But what I used to do, which a lot of people do, we've all got different ways, Malcolm, haven't we, of self-soothing. And
Yes.
mine was kind of, if it wasn't drink and drugs, workaholic. Being a workaholic is a great way of shutting down those inner demons and those dragons, as we know today. But another good one was putting my through, which I know a lot of people do as well, is putting yourself through a lot of physical pain. So my thing was either going out for a long run and really pushing myself to excess, or going out on the bike. And on this one particular day or evening, I I kind of really pushed myself for three-quarters of an hour in the place where I lived in Dawlish in Devon at the time, and cycling along the cycle path, for anyone that knows, right next to the railway line between Dawlish and Dawlish Warren. And it was a full moon, the sun was going down, and out of nowhere on this high 20-foot high seawall right next to the railway line, a freak wave came over and hit me and knocked me off my bike. And for the first few seconds, I kind of felt really embarrassed. I looked around and there was no one around, and I kind of got back up, and literally, at the moment I got back up, the second wave come crashing in and caught me kind of off guard and off balance, and it hit me against the wall, and I kind of sprawling down. Before I realised, I'm sort of falling 20 feet down towards the rocks, and horrendous for those first few seconds because I knew that stretch really well. And I was just waiting for the crack, like an egg kind of being dropped from high. And luckily, I kind of managed to land in the freezing cold water. And I actually sort of, as I resurfaced again, I knew round about where the bike was. That had kind of just missed me. And as I surfaced, even though the water was freezing, I kind of punched the air in celebration, knowing that I'd had a close escape. But that was just the start of my worries, really. Within seconds, the reality hit, and another wave came slamming in, hit me against the algae-covered kind of 20-foot high wall. And before I knew it, another one came in 5 seconds later, and this continued for a few minutes to the point that I was almost being knocked out. And thinking, well, I'm not going to get out of here. The nearest walkway or the way you could get out was probably, I knew, hundreds of meters away. So I knew it was kind of, how on earth am I going to get out of this? And very quickly in them sort of situations, as people know, when when you're kind of brushing with death, you know that you've not got much time. And so I looked out on the horizon towards the sun, where the sun was going down, and saw the lovely big full moon there. And I realized that if I could swim out a certain distance, it would be a lot calmer, and I'd got much better chance of surviving. And even after a few minutes, Malcolm, I could really feel that my body was starting to kind of adjust to the freezing cold water. It was April, which is, March, April, one of the coldest times of the year, because it's had several months of winter. And so I got to this point where I thought, right, I'm going to have to use all of my energy. And thanks for reminding me that there was a time one day where I was younger and fitter, as we all were. But luckily, I was probably as fit as I ever was in my life, and I managed somehow to swim against the tide with every bit of energy I had for the next kind of 5 and 10 minutes. And I managed to get beyond the waves, sort of 50 meters out. And it was then, for the first time, that I was able to kind of take stock of the situation. I was almost sort of semi-traumatized in that first 10, 15 minutes. And then it kind of suddenly dawned on me, the sun was going down, and I'm not going to get out of this. And it's at that first moment that you start to realize and contemplate death. No one's around, no one's walking their dog after dark. I knew that stretch really well. I got no chance to swim into the nearest area to climb out. And at that time, even it doesn't take very long in freezing cold water before the hypothermia starts to come in. And the first signs of it are your organs, because your organs are the softest tissue. So I started to feel it in my chest and my kidneys, and my head was starting to really ache and getting a headache. And in that next, well, obviously I'm giving you time frames now, but at the time seems to stop. And
Yeah, exactly.
it's just unless you've been there in these kind of situations, we all hope that we're going to wake up, don't we? And one day, and or not wake up, we die in our sleep, or we're at a sudden death. But when you're contemplating your death, it moves you into a different mindset. And so I got to a period where I was doing a lot of contemplating, and all weird kind of stuff starts to come in your mind, Malcolm. I'm never going to give my daughters away. Someone else is going to inherit all the insurance money. They're probably never going to find my body. It's going to be washed out, and and they're going to think I've taken off or something, or had a mental breakdown and moved to a different part of the world, or there's 100 things going through your mind, because nobody, if they ever find you, we're ever going to know what happened to you. And that sort of scared me. But the biggest thing is, once you kind of start to face death and start looking at it closely, which is something most of us will never do right until the end part of our life. All kinds of emotions are stirring up from the past. We all have these moments where different emotions from the past are triggered, but it's almost like a super triggering event where all those emotions you've never reconciled, all those shadows you've never come to peace with, all seem to be coming up at once. If even 20 odd years later, it's hard to explain this.
Well, it's interesting because the Greeks call it kairos time. The chronos time is the time of the watch. So we take an hour, we know it's an hour. But you went into a timeless zone because actually you were no longer living according to the laws of you as a human being getting on with your life. Something was changing dramatically. And at that moment, you presumed you were going to die. You had no.
Absolutely. There's a knowing. There's almost like, I wouldn't say I've accepted it, but it. And that's a very kind of different thing. And the fear, you can't even quarter of a century later, I can't explain the fear that you get that starts to overwhelm your whole sense of body. And all kinds of things are going through your mind. And fast forward to, I'm literally going through a million different thoughts and feelings in this time. And then there reached a time where I started to go, I started to go in and out of consciousness, and I knew I was getting a bit scared. And And I lost a few seconds here and there, a bit like when we're kind of in the evening, or we're sat there and we fall asleep and have a nap for 10 minutes. We wake up, we know things have shifted. It kind of felt a bit like that. And the next thing I kind of was conscious of, I wasn't there. I was almost in some kind of dream state. And I don't want to talk about having a kind of life review, because it wasn't a life review, but the best way I always have explained this is that imagine the most profound, emotionally moving moments in your life, good and bad, negative and positive. I seem to be reliving those particular experiences. And I'll give you just one example of many. I got knocked down as an 11-year-old kid in London, living in London. I ran across the road without warning and got hit by a car. Now, that was a traumatic event. I just about survived, but I relived that experience in the water, only on a more profound, higher level of consciousness level. So it's almost like I was living it with extra feelings than I would have been at the time as an 11-year-old.
So the body carries the memories of these things, and they can get triggered. I often see this when I'm running a therapy group. Someone will get ricocheted by something, and then that feeling will get triggered as though it had happened yesterday.
I mean, it's so true. It's so true. That memory is alive, and we just need to bring it to life again, don't we? The body does keep the score, as we know, many years later. So this one particular experience, I seem to go through the whole experience again as a boy, cut to the next scene, and I now, for whatever reason, life is showing me the experience from the woman who was driving the car that actually hit me. And it was almost like I was inside her consciousness, seeing from her eyes. But, I could even see the hands on the wheel, and I'm driving towards a version of myself. And I hit myself, I hit the little boy, the 11-year-old boy, and crashed the car into the wall. And I can feel the woman's heartbeat, and I can feel her emotions. She's crying hysterically in this kind of out of state kind of consciousness. And I'm actually living her experience.
So actually, you'd entered into the superconscious realm in that moment in preparation for dying. In effect, you were reviewing your life. People say your life flashes before you. You were preparing to die, even though you didn't want to die. You saw no way through that, did you?
No, I mean, you don't know all this. We're talking very, very contextually and kind of reflectively now. At the time, you're not even sure. It's almost like a semi-dream.
Yeah. And in fact, that's one of the geniuses of shock system in the body, is that it actually takes you out of that horrendous fear and actually takes you into an altered state of consciousness. Certainly when you're preparing to die, and I've heard this from lots of people who've had near-death experiences, when you're preparing to die, something changes, and it's almost as though you're lifted above your everyday consciousness.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the way it was. In that I'm having an out-of-body experience with a dream-like state. I'm living the experience of this woman, and I'm crying hysterically. I'm feeling all the emotions in her body, and she stumbles out of the car. She rips all her tires. She sort of almost stumbles across to the boy that looks like me on the floor, dead, and she is wailing, and everyone else is kind of coming around. And literally, what was weird, I felt her emotions as if they were my own emotions. And the funny thing is, Malcolm, I'd never until that point my accident was 1976. I was an 11-year-old boy. I had the near death in 99. I'd never given much thought to that poor woman and what I'd put her through, whether I'd changed her life and what she'd gone through. I'd never until that time in the water experienced and felt what she empathically, compassionately must have gone through. And there were lots of other experiences like that, which I won't go into. And anyway, that kind of bit finished. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I've gone through the anger stage, of I'm only 34 years old. I don't deserve to die. I'm not a bad person. Why is life doing this to me? So I go through all the anger of dying early, or perceived to be dying early. And I'm still in this kind of semi-conscious state. And the funny thing is, Malcolm, once you go past all the regrets and the anger bit, I then seem to somehow on the other side of it come to some kind of acceptance, some kind of inner peace. And the weird thing is, if like the replays, the life review bit wasn't strange enough, I then started this amazing conversation in my head, which seemed, I mean, it couldn't have gone on for more than 2 hours because that's roughly how long I was ended up being in the water, apparently. But this conversation seemed to go on for weeks, literally. And the only thing I can sort of say about it is that this conversation, and it is two-way, we all have an inner speak, we all have an inner voice, call it wisdom, and insight on the good side, you know, the good hero. And then we've got the anti-hero, which is the damning kind of, you know, constricting.
Well, in religion, they talk about the still small voice within. So actually, you accessed that still small voice, or
Yeah,
whatever your version of it was. So what
yeah.
happened? What happened with the this voice? What was it saying to you?
Well, it started off with the actual first few sentences I can remember just like they were yesterday, which was along the lines of, "I'm not, you know, not a bad person. Um, what is happening to me? You know, why am I going through this? You know, my 34 years aren't enough on earth. I felt like I was going to do, like a lot of us, Malcolm, we wait for certain things before we start living our lives, don't we? You know, I'm
Yeah.
going to start, you know, next year, you know, 10 years time when I retire, that sort of thing. But I started to feel a real sad, once the anger had gone, I felt a real regret of all the life I'd not lived, really.
And I think for most of us, we know intellectually that we're going to die, but we are not triggered with that. You got triggered with that, which set in chain a whole. And I know there's a very amazing end to this story as well, which is extraordinary. But so don't know. Let me hear a little bit about this voice. Was it a wise person that was speaking to you?
So we kind of know the signature tune, the tone of our own inner voice, don't we?
Yeah.
But this voice was still a male, but a lot calmer. The only way I could probably describe it, imagine that I live another 100 lives and become hopefully, hopefully, he says, a lot wiser. It's kind of a part of you, but it's not of you. This voice, because it was a lot calmer, more serene, more wise, more insightful than I knew I was, or my
So
consciousness was.
this whatever spoke to you was not caught up in the everyday hubbub of the world.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It was gentle, loving, caring, compassionate, but also wise and insightful. And anyway, I started to have a two-way dialogue with this voice and started to ask my biggest question. You know, I've always been a curious child. Um, I did have a bit of a shift after that 11-year-old boy incident, you know, being knocked down, where I felt the next day something had shifted in me. And I know it was some kind of intuition I picked up because I started to sense different things in my mother and other people. And so that kicked a chain reaction off at 11 years old to start being very curious about the world. And there's a lot more than we're told. But you know, what I got to a point with this conversation where I was asking all questions about the future of the world. You know, again, it's a dream state, a semi-conscious, about, you know, the purpose of emotions and where we're going, and compassion, how we're linked on an energy level. It was just kind of incredible, really.
And all this time, Bill, you're 2 hours in freezing water, and presumably, you know, someone less fit than you would be dead by then.
Absolutely. I mean, you're not meant to really survive more than about an hour in freezing cold water. Um, you know, I'm not conscious of it as well, 100%. So I'm kind of semi-conscious. I'm not at this stage, Malcolm. I'm not even sure if I'm still alive, because
Ah,
you're
yeah.
in that such a dream state. You know, you're not even really sure of what's kind of. And even today, all these years later, I still can't, you know, properly kind of understand it. So, you know, the conversation, you know, became the book, Dying for a Change, because I had to get this stuff out of me. And what is
Just to
funny,
say, Bill, you wrote a book called Dying for Change based on this experience.
based on experience, based on what I learned and picked up in the, you know, in the water, bearing in mind, Malcolm, because of being a dyslexic, dyspraxic child, which wasn't even kind of identified back in the 70s, I'd not read a book for about 20 years since leaving school. So, you know, that's quite incredible. Not a single book. And so, you know, this stuff was all new to me, and it was all insightful. And, you know, kind of, I'm trying to absorb it all because it was just so big. But in a weird way, my consciousness could hold it and kind of understand it.
I think that's the thing. It felt like you came to peace with whatever was happening for you, even though you were in a sort of a semi oblivious state. You were still there was a peacefulness in what I'm hearing in the story.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Oh,
That I'd never
and
experienced.
was this voice calling you by name? Did it sort of was it like a loving father or mother, or what was the
Um,
voice like?
I mean, almost non-binary. Almost it was definitely a male voice, but the energy was a very strong mixture of feminine and kind of masculine. And that, you know, very loving, but at the same time very authoritative. But just, I still can't really, you know, properly kind of understand it. But the information that I got was incredible, which I later, you know, got together with a book. So, you know, conversation went on for what seemed like weeks, and then, you know, a couple of things happened again in the water. I seemed to come back to more of being conscious suddenly of what's happening around me. And I remember by now that, you know, I'm kind of looking down and the sun had almost completely disappeared and the stars were starting to come out. And there was one particular scene that I'll never forget. In that, you know, along that coastline, there's some really strong red rock, you know, limestone rock. And I remember looking at the top of this rock on the edge of a cliff, and there was a seagull there, and I just was mystified. You know, when we get captured by a particular piece of beauty and light, or you know, anything art, and it just absolutely captured me. This seagull with the light, you know, the bearing, the rest of the light just kind of captured on the seagull, and then the real bright red of the rocks. And I just remember watching this seagull sort of glide down. It was almost like Jonathan Seagull, and glide down. And the next minute, I'm actually the seagull. So my consciousness has somehow shifted from me in the water, struggling to survive, to this serene, gliding seagull that's kind of skimming the edge of the water. And it was just sort of some kind of weird dreamlike state.
Well, except
Amazing.
the mystics all say, Bill, or a lot of the mystics say that actually we enter into a state when we become awakened, and in that moment you were awakened, and you were awakened by your it's seemingly impending death arriving very shortly. And what I'm hearing is that in that awakenedness, in that awakened state, you were one with everything. And I remember
Yeah.
a friend of mine who fasted for 3 years because she said, I want to know God. And if I can't know God, I'm going to starve myself to death. And then something happened and she ate an apple and she was the apple and she was everything. And it's like for 3 weeks, she lived in that extraordinary state. And then finally, she came back to real, or she came back to our everyday consciousness. But what I'm hearing is you had such a potent experience that you were no longer Bill. You'd started to become the cosmos.
All of life, unless someone's experienced that, Malcolm, hopefully your friend, you know, and you've had other experiences as well, I know,
Yeah.
but unless you've been there and experienced, it's almost beyond words, isn't it?
Well, it sounds crazy, but actually, what I'm hearing is that you were absolutely sane. You know, I mean, as sane as you could possibly be, Bill. Anyway, but actually, you know, there's no trace there of sort of delusion or of sort of psychosis. What I'm
No.
hearing is a dancing with death as death started to approach you.
Yeah. So you know, cue the end of the conversation, the seagull event, and then the next thing, you know, like click and another scene, and I'm in a hallway, which is bizarre. And I'm looking around, you know, where did the seagull go? Where did the water go? I'm in my hallway of where we lived at the time in a big kind of Victorian house in Dawlish, and I'm looking around and I see some people brush past me, and it's my ex-wife with my two children, and I hear the doorbell go. And my ex-wife goes to the front door, and she's got each of my daughters one each side. And she opens the door, and there's a policeman and a policewoman stood there. And they said, "Mrs. Murtha," and yeah, and they kind of stutter a bit, and then they say, "I'm afraid we've found your husband's body in Teignmouth, just up the coast." I'm sorry to inform you, that he's dead, and all the rest of it. And I could hear. And there was that moment that I'm going through this vision, which I'm then now presuming is a future of this is what I'm now spirit, or wherever we go afterwards.
Yeah.
And I'm now viewing the time a few days later where they find my body on the shore or in the water. I mean, that is scary.
But it looked like there was no other option than that. That was the only direction that had any possibility. It's dark, the stars are out. There's no one walking their dogs at that time of night, and you are there in the water waiting to die. And then something magical happened, didn't it, Bill?
Oh, just magical. So I'm in the hallway, and suddenly I know absolutely that I've got a choice. I can make a choice. And I decide that I'm not ready for death yet. I've got too much unfulfilled work. I'd made my life about work, or, the wrong kind of work, not my creative kind of other side of work, which was always going to be tomorrow. And so I decided that I'm not ready for death. And the minute, literally, with every fiber of my being, Malcolm, I made the decision to stay, the whole hallway and everything, the police, my daughters, all disappeared. I'm back in the water. Whoosh, it was like having an electric shock. The cold kind of come back in again, and I'm back in the water. And like, first few kind of minutes, I'm like, what's just happened? I can't even contextualize it. I can't even explain it. So I look to the shoreline, and there's a 3-4 story building, and there's a light at the top of this building. So this is like 50 odd meters away on the other side of the railway line. I look up at this building, and I do something I've never done up to then at 34 years old. I started praying, and I didn't know what or who I was praying to. I was just praying for savior, for another chance, for redemption. And I could see a silhouette at the top of this sort of flat, and I was praying to whoever was there that they could see me. And then I kind of looked away again, and very quickly I then heard a voice shouting at me. And I was so scared, Malcolm, to turn around in the water to look towards the shore, to see if there's a shadow there, because by now it's starting to get dark. I was too scared that it was in my mind, that it created this hopeful vision and noise. So it took me a few minutes, but then when I did turn around, there was a guy waving to me from the side next to the railway line. And the first thing he said, which has kind of really got me angry, the first thing he said was, "Do you want help?" And so I was so kind of incensed, of everything I've gone through and how I was feeling. And long story short, they managed to fire somehow one of these orange buoys with a rope on out to me. And because of the hypothermia, I couldn't grab the rope or the buoy. It was like, a hot knife going through butter. So I kind of managed to somehow grab the buoy. And this is where the funny thing comes in. There was that voice that I'm talking about said literally, word for word, look for the noose at the end of the buoy. So I kind of grabbed the buoy, frantically struggling around in the freezing cold water. I'm grabbing the buoy, and at the end there was a meter-long noose, which I managed to slip my arm through. And then what they managed to do, by now a few more people are kind of on the water side, and they started to all haul me in almost like a fish, about several hundred meters along to where there was a break. And of course, by now there was flashing lights and an ambulance waiting, and they kind of whisked me off quickly to Torbay Hospital. And even then, it was half an hour from Dawlish to a weaving road to Torquay on the back road, on the coastal road. And even then, I knew it was touch and go because I was in and out of consciousness. And I got to the sort of, the hospital. I knew it was serious because they wanted to get a lot of, chemicals and everything into me to kind of bring my body temperature up again. So they managed to do that. And, I had they kind of knocked me out, and I was gone most of the night. And anyway, I woke up next morning, the sun was up, I was in Torbay Hospital. And it was that kind of weird feeling of, oh my God, I've lived an amazing ordeal. Who on earth is even going to believe the half of it? And I got to a point where I was trying to make sense of it, and I thought, this is just like for another day, you know, this is too much for me to take on board. And my wife came in the morning, and you know, I was talking to her about it, but I could only share the very basics of it. Didn't mention about the conversation or anything about that. It was too big, and I didn't want people to think I'm kind of mad. And anyway, in the afternoon, the matron come over, and she seemed a bit flustered and irritated, and she said, Mr. Murtha, there's a journalist downstairs for you. He wants to talk to you. And I thought it was because we were, you know, doing quite well with that football, and we were in the papers every week. I thought it was to do with the football. And she said, no, this journalist wants to talk to you about a guy that had spotted you. And that, of course, this is the first news to me. And so I go down and talk to this journalist. And there are apparently a lot of national papers, the local papers were having this big story. I knew nothing about all this. So I was talking to the journalist, and he sort of, in outline, he told me that, yeah, the guy had spotted you. And what transpires is that, and you've heard this story many times, the guy had been asking his friend in the apartment below for 9 months that he wants to borrow a telescope to look at the stars, look at the moon. And on the very afternoon that I'd gone in the water that evening, he had finally brought the telescope up for this guy, Nathan, to borrow. And so Nathan had kind of set the telescope up. It was a full moon. He'd gone away to make a drink on the other side of the apartment, come back, and the telescope had dropped. And he thought, that's a bit strange. And he actually looked through it, and there was like seagulls, kind of, you know, what he thought was seagulls flashing around. And it turns out he took a closer look, and oh my God, there was me thrashing around in the water. So he apparently was the guy that called the emergency services, and he was the guy that was waving to me from the side. And, you know, the next day, because I wanted to meet Nathan, because this was just, the whole thing was too big for me. So Nathan come around our home, and we kind of had a chat, and then we had pictures for the media and that, and it was all in the papers. But, you know, I was still struggling to understand the enormity of this coincidence, you know, serendipity, you know, meaningful coincidences. And it actually took me a year and a half before I could even talk to anyone about the conversation and everything. Didn't even start writing about it, because a lot of people won't realize this when near deaths. You believe that you're going to change your life the next day. It doesn't happen like that. Sometimes,
No, that's right.
we all know this, that the enormity of it can be so big that you'd rather put it all in a box and just get on with your life and keep being destructive and getting worse.
I think the thing is, at those moments, we have the opportunity. We've flipped our lives 180 degrees, or our lives have flipped 180 degrees, and you've got the opportunity to go, what am I going to do with this one wild and precious life? How am I going to live it? And I know that you made enormous changes. You went from being a sort of like, you know, a sort of guy who was hungry for money and sort of experiences in life and all of this sort of stuff, to someone who's actually using your skills now to assist people who struggle. And you've become a very successful life coach, and also you've written a number of books. So there's something it's something got hatched in you from that experience. And you're right, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a bit like we end a relationship, we think we've ended a relationship, but it takes ages for it to actually unpick itself. And what I can see is that you have unpicked yourself over the years, and you've become something else, someone else. But actually, who you are now, you wouldn't choose to go back to who you were then, would you?
No. And you know, there is, I believe, now we've all got a different concept of this. I believe that we all, when we go through a near death, that is a post-traumatic stress event. And what we forget is that because of, you know, it's hard to land the emotions around that experience, that extraordinary traumatic event. We literally, if we do the work, we go through a dark night of the soul, don't we? And you know, what we have to do is realize that one follows the other. So you're going through the dark night of the soul when you're doing the work. And if you do the work, you're hopefully going towards post-traumatic growth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I believe, I've kind of thought about this a lot. I've talked to other near-death experiences. Well, Evelyn Ballerino, Kenneth Ringer wrote a book called Lessons from the Light. I kind of connected with Evelyn a few years after my accident. They've studied 30,000 near-death experiences, so they know what they're doing. And actually, there's a similar format, similar growth spurt, similar post-traumatic growth if you do the work. And I truly believe now that, on a mini near-death scale, the whole planet has now just gone through the last 3.5 years a mini near-death experience. And I think we're collectively, consciously, going through our own dark night of the soul, whatever that looks like to everyone, before we can get to the post-traumatic growth.
It's funny. I remember talking to Sir George Trevelyan, who was known as the sort of grandfather of the New Age up in the 60s, and he said that it has to get right to the edge before we change. A little bit like the Alcoholics Anonymous map. You've got to go down to the bottom before you start to find your way out. And I think what you're looking at is your individual scenario, and then you're looking at the global scenario. Actually, we are getting close to the point where we can't continue the way we were. So you, in a microcosm, couldn't continue the way you were. You could have done, but life wasn't going to let you do that.
No.
And what you're seeing is this is actually acting out in the world as well now.
Yeah. And I think for me, where I was at that moment in 99, I was doing a lot of acting out. I wasn't expressing my creativity and true authentic self. I wasn't being vulnerable. It was all about ego. It was all about outer. It was all about materialism. I mean, we could be writing the script for the last few years, couldn't we, before we hit the pandemic? The pandemic has upended people's beliefs and conceptions and ideas about who they are and what they want to do with their life.
Yeah. But you are now living a life that you are proud of.
Yeah. It's an authentic life. Don't get me wrong.
That's the thing. It's an authentic life. And so this, what looks like adversity, this is very much the theme of what we're doing with the podcast. We go through what looks like adversity. We go through adversity. I went through the death of my daughter to suicide. You go through adversity going, why am I being punished by this nasty God who's sort of like raining down sort of hell on me? But actually, we are being refined and educated by our experiences and our suffering.
Yeah.
And interesting, the word compassion means with suffering. If we're to have compassion, we have to go to the place of suffering with others. And because you've suffered, and you went through a hell of a doozy of a story, you are actually more available for other people's suffering now.
I mean, as we get older, we kind of understand that actually pain and suffering is the route out of this, don't we? We understand if we're looking for what that pain and suffering is giving us in the moment. But if we could take a more holistic level, a more futuristic level, we would understand that actually, usually, a bit like I always say, emotions are messengers, Malcolm. They've got big lessons for us. That's why emotions are showing up. I think these big events of pain and suffering are helping us, almost with an invisible cloak, because they're not looking like growth and personal development up close, are they, to begin with? We're just thinking that it's suffering trauma.
Well, when you get your life upended in the way that you've described, in the way that I've described, you can't go back. You can go back, but it's almost like something won't leave you in peace. And I remember James Hillman, the psychotherapist, wrote about inside every one of us is a diamond, Daemon, not a demon, but it's like a spirit that's inside us. And it will drive us nuts until we do what it is we were born to do. And so I'm hearing that you got one hell of a powerful lesson, and that you have actually turned your life 180 degrees into something you're now proud of. And you're now not looking to look after number one, you're looking to be a part of the healing of the world.
Yeah.
That sounds a bit over the top, but it's like, I think we all play our small parts in that as well.
And what's really strange the last few years, especially since March 2020, the pandemic, we've done our coaching now for a long time, me and Jane. But I've noticed this last few years that more and more people are feeling that they're almost wearing the wrong coat in their life, the wrong size shoes, and that they need to be doing something that brings out their creativity, ingenuity, imagination, anything that the job that they're doing is no longer fulfilling them, giving them passion, purpose, and meaning. And this is always the case, and it's always been the case for therapy, and it's always been the case with coaching. But something seems to have happened that's put it into fast gear the last few years.
Well, I think we are going through a major shift in consciousness on our planet. And we need to go through a major shift in consciousness. And will we survive as a species? Well, I think we are being woken up. And I'm not talking about the woke culture. I'm just talking about that actually coming to terms with the who we really are, not the persona that we've established in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, that's an amazing story. So if you were able to sort of like to sort of quantify what was the dragon you had to slay in order to move forward from this experience?
Right. It's never kind of simple, but if I had to put a headline show reel on it, the dragon is trying to live up. The dragon I had to slay was the belief that you had to live a certain way, which society and culture say, you know, in the matrix we should be living. That materialistic outer accolade, you know, what you've got is kind of a sense of your identity. You know, the dragon for me was not getting in touch with your real inner self, your feelings, getting connected to your emotions in the body, showing your vulnerability, being fabulously flawed, you know, all those good things that we've kind of, those of us that have been waking, we're all waking up, we just don't realize it. But I think what it is a realization that is waking up in all of us is that the old story, that patriarch, top down, materialistic, chase the money, we've all bought into a story that actually is not true, and it doesn't sustain and fulfill us, does it?
Very good. Well, that's lovely, Bill. Thank you so much for coming along today and doing this with me. And you know, I've you know, we talked about your story quite some time ago, and I was blown away by it, and I'm blown away again today. You know, hearing the extra. Jung said everything is synchronicity. That guy gave the telescope that day, it pointing downwards instead of pointing upwards. There was a whole bunch of stuff that came together in order to give you a very profound experience, but then to actually save you and to pull you through into a different place.
Lovely. Thank you for having me, Malcolm. It's been a pleasure.
Great. Well, I'll look forward to further conversations with you. Thank
Great.
you, Bill.
Okay. Thank you, Malcolm. Take care.